I watched my father's face twist into that familiar sneer as my mother reached into her purse during my wedding reception, and in that moment, I knew he was about to destroy the happiest day of my life. "What's this supposed to be, Linda?" Dad's voice carried across our table, loud enough that Aunt Helen and Uncle Rick turned from their conversation. "Your big contribution?" Mom's hands trembled as she withdrew a small navy blue bank passbook, the kind they stopped issuing years ago. The edges were worn soft from handling, and I could see her fingers had left permanent indentations on the cover. She placed it on the white tablecloth between them like it was made of glass. "I wanted to help with Jessica's honeymoon," she said quietly. "I've been saving. Dad cut her off with a bark of laughter that made my stomach drop. "With what money, Linda? Your little part-time job at the library?" My new husband, Daniel, squeezed my hand under the table. I could feel the tension radiating from his body. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. We'd specifically kept the seating arrangement casual to avoid exactly this kind of scene, but somehow my parents had ended up side by side, and now the fragile peace I'd maintained throughout my engagement was shattering like champagne flutes hitting marble. Dad picked up the passbook and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the page, and then something happened that I didn't expect. His smirk froze. The color drained from his face, so quickly I thought he might be having a heart attack. For 3 full seconds he just stared at the numbers on that page, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. "This can't be right," he whispered. Mom reached across and gently took the passbook from his suddenly limp fingers. Her voice was steady now, stronger than I'd heard it in 23 years. "Oh, it's right, Richard. Every single cent." The entire table had gone silent. My maid of honor, Katie, had stopped mid-bite, fork suspended in the air. Daniel's parents exchanged confused glances. And I sat there, my heart hammering, watching my mother transform into someone I didn't recognize. "That's impossible," Dad said, but his voice had lost its edge. "You don't have that kind of, where did you? That's not really your concern anymore, is it?" Mom's smile was small and sharp. "We've been divorced for 2 years, Richard. But I wanted you to see this today. I wanted you to see it on Jessica's wedding day specifically. I felt like I was watching a play where I'd missed the first act. My mother, who'd spent my entire childhood apologizing for not having enough, who'd clipped coupons and bought day-old bread and patched my jeans instead of buying new ones. She was sitting there with a passbook that had apparently rendered my father speechless. "Mom," I managed to say, "what's going on?" She turned to me with tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame or sorrow. They were something else entirely. Something that looked almost like triumph. "Sweetheart, I need to tell you a story. It's about your grandmother, and a promise I made 25 years ago. A promise your father knew nothing about." Dad pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "Linda, don't you dare. Sit down, Richard." Mom's voice cracked like a whip. "For once in your life, you're going to listen." And he did. That's what shocked me most. My father, who'd spent my entire life talking over everyone, who'd dismissed my mother's opinions like they were background noise, who'd made her feel small and insignificant for as long as I could remember, he sat back down. His hands were shaking. Mom opened the passbook again and turned it so I could see the balance. My vision blurred, then sharpened. I read the number once. Twice. 3 times. It still didn't make sense. That many zeros couldn't possibly be right. The amount in that old passbook would pay for not just our honeymoon, but a house. Maybe 2 houses. Maybe a small apartment building. "How?" I breathed. "Your grandmother was a very clever woman," Mom said. "And she knew something about your father long before I figured it out." She looked at Dad, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. Katie leaned forward, completely forgetting about the wedding photographer who was awkwardly trying to decide if he should keep shooting. "Mrs. Patterson, what did your mother do?" Mom's laugh was light, almost girlish. "She bet on me. When everyone else thought I was making a mistake marrying Richard, when his family was looking down at me for coming from the poor side of town, when even my own father suggested I could do better, she bet on me." "Linda," Dad's voice was pleading now. "Please don't do this here." "Why not?" Mom's eyebrows arched. "You had no problem mocking me here. You had no problem trying to humiliate me in front of our daughter and her new family. In front of everyone. You wanted to prove once again that I was worthless, that I'd contributed nothing to Jessica's life, that I was the same scared girl you'd controlled for 18 years of marriage." The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel's mother, Patricia, cleared her throat softly, and I realized this wasn't just awkward anymore. This was a reckoning. Something had been building for years, maybe decades, and it was all coming to a head right here between the champagne fountain and the wedding cake. But here's what you never knew, Mom continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, which somehow made everyone lean in closer. Here's what I've been keeping from you for all these years, through every insult, every dismissive comment, every time you made me feel like I wasn't enough. She paused, and I could see her gathering herself, preparing for whatever bomb she was about to drop. My father looked like he wanted to run, but his pride kept him pinned to his seat. He couldn't make a scene by leaving. Not here. Not at his daughter's wedding with 200 guests watching. The day after you proposed to me, Mom said. My mother pulled me aside. She told me she didn't trust you. Said she'd watched how you treated waiters and cashiers, how you spoke about your own mother behind her back, how you'd already started making little comments about my clothes and my friends. Mom's voice cracked slightly. She said she loved me, but she thought I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I felt Daniel's hand tighten around mine. This was a side of my grandma I'd never heard about. She died when I was 12, and I only remembered her as this tiny, quiet woman who baked incredible cookies and let me play in her garden. The idea of her confronting my mother about Dad seemed impossible. But you married him anyway, Katie said softly. I did. Mom nodded. I was young and in love, or what I thought was love. And Mom knew she couldn't stop me. So instead, she made me a different offer. Dad made a sound like a wounded animal. He knew what was coming. Somehow he knew. She gave me a choice, Mom continued. She said she'd been saving money her whole life. She'd grown up during the Depression, watched her own mother lose everything, and she'd sworn she'd never be vulnerable again. By the time I got married, she had a substantial amount set aside. Not a fortune, but significant. The photographer had given up all pretense of working, and was just listening now. Even the catering staff had slowed down, trying to catch every word while pretending to arrange dessert plates. Mom told me she'd put half of her savings into a trust for me, but with conditions, Mom said. I couldn't touch it while I was married to you, Richard. Not 1 cent. It would sit there, growing, invested wisely by her financial advisor, completely separate from our marital assets. If we stayed married, it would go to Jessica when she turned 30. But if we divorced... She paused, letting the words settle. If we divorced before Jessica's 25th birthday, it would all come to me. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the distant sound of traffic outside the venue. I could hear one of the chandeliers making a tiny electrical hum. You knew about this? I asked my father. All this time? He suspected, Mom answered for him. Didn't you, Richard? You always wondered why I never fought harder for more money in the divorce. Why I accepted that tiny settlement without a lawyer. Why I seemed almost eager to sign the papers. Dad's face had gone from pale to red. You manipulated. I did nothing, Mom interrupted. I simply accepted the terms of my mother's gift. A gift she set up because she knew, somehow she knew, that you would show your true colors eventually. She bet that you couldn't maintain the facade for 25 years. That you'd crack. That you'd push me too far. She leaned back in her chair, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. And she was right. I did the math in my head. My parents had divorced 2 years ago, right after my 21st birthday. 4 years before the deadline. Which meant, you waited, I said, the realization hitting me like cold water. You could have left him earlier, but you waited until I was old enough to handle it. Mom's eyes filled with tears again. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know the divorce was hard on you, but I couldn't leave while you were still in high school. And I couldn't tell you about the money because I would have told Dad, I finished. The truth of it was bitter. I'd been angry at Mom after the divorce, had blamed her for breaking up the family, had even moved in with Dad for 6 months before I realized what he was really like without her there to manage his moods and deflect his criticism. Your grandmother gave you the greatest gift she could, Patricia said suddenly. Daniel's mother had been quiet this whole time, but now she was looking at my mom with something like awe. She gave you an escape route. And patience. She gave me hope, Mom corrected quietly. Every time your father belittled me, every time he made me feel worthless, I'd think about that passbook. I'd imagine the balance growing. I'd picture the day I could finally show him that I wasn't the useless woman he'd convinced me I was. How much? Dad asked hoarsely. How much did your mother start with? Mom closed the passbook and slid it back into her purse. That's none of your business. But I'll tell you this, her financial advisor was very good at his job. Over 23 years with compound interest and smart investments, her initial gift became substantial. This is fraud, Dad blustered, but there was no conviction behind it. Some kind of hidden asset. It was never a marital asset, Mom said calmly. It was a trust set up by my mother before our marriage, with very specific conditions. I had a lawyer review everything before we signed the divorce papers. It was completely legal. You got the house, most of the retirement accounts, and your precious boat. I got my freedom and my dignity back. I think that's more than fair. I watched my father struggle with this information. I could see him running through the years in his mind, probably remembering every time he'd mocked her for clipping coupons, every time he'd told her she was financially dependent on him, every time he'd held money over her head like a weapon. All while she'd had this secret nest egg growing in the background, completely beyond his reach. And you chose today to tell me this, Dad said, his voice barely controlled. At Jessica's wedding. I chose today, Mom agreed. Because you couldn't help yourself. You saw me pull out this passbook, trying to give my daughter a gift, and you immediately tried to humiliate me. Just like you did at Jessica's high school graduation when I gave her that cheap necklace. Just like you did at her college send-off when I offered to help with books. You never could resist putting me down, especially in public. She stood up, smoothing down her mother-of-the-bride dress. A beautiful lavender creation that I now realized probably hadn't come from the clearance rack at Macy's like she'd claimed. But here's the thing, Richard, Mom said, looking down at him with a serene smile. I don't need your validation anymore. I haven't needed it for 2 years. And I especially don't need it today on my daughter's wedding day, when I'm about to give her the honeymoon of her dreams. Mom, you don't have to. I started, but she held up her hand. I want a baby. Your grandmother would have wanted this. She saved this money for our family, for the women in our family, so we'd never have to feel trapped like she did. Like I did. She pulled an envelope from her purse and placed it in front of me. 6 weeks in Europe. First-class flights. Hotels I picked out myself. Tours, restaurants, experiences. Everything you and Daniel talked about wanting but said you couldn't afford. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were tickets, confirmations, itineraries. Paris. Rome. Barcelona. The Amalfi Coast. Everything we'd dreamed about while planning a modest weekend in the mountains. Oh my God, Daniel whispered, looking over my shoulder. But there's more, Mom said, and now her smile turned into something else. Something that made my father push back from the table again. There's something else you need to know, Richard. Something else my mother predicted. Dad stood up this time. I don't have to listen to this. Yes, you do, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. You owe her that much. You owe us both that much. He hesitated, caught between his instinct to flee and his desperate need to maintain appearances. Around us, the reception had completely stopped. Even the band had given up pretending to play, instruments hanging silent. 200 people were watching this drama unfold, and my father was trapped center stage. Sit down, Dad, I said again. For once in your life, show some courage and face what you've done. And that's when my mother's expression shifted from triumph to something else entirely. Something that looked almost like pity. She reached into her purse one more time, pulling out a second envelope. This one was yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had cracked but still held. My mother left instructions, Mom said quietly. She made me promise not to open this envelope until today. Until after I'd shown you the passbook, Richard. Until after the truth came out. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the remaining wax seal. She said there was one more thing you needed to hear. One more piece of the puzzle. Dad's face had gone beyond pale now. He looked gray, almost green, like he was going to be sick. And suddenly I realized, he knew what was in that letter. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Linda, please, he whispered. Not here. Not in front of. In front of your daughter? Mom's voice was steel. In front of the family you claimed to love? The family you controlled and diminished and made small. She unfolded the letter, and I could see my grandmother's distinctive handwriting covering both sides of the page. She knew, Richard. My mother knew everything. The room seemed to tilt. Katie grabbed my arm to steady me, though I wasn't sure if I'd actually moved. Daniel's father stood up, perhaps ready to intervene if things got worse. But I couldn't look away from my mother's face as she began to read. My dearest Linda, Mom's voice shook but didn't break. If you're reading this, then you've finally freed yourself from Richard Patterson, and for that I'm grateful. You've shown our Jessica what real strength looks like. You've demonstrated that patience isn't weakness, and that a woman who bends doesn't have to break. Tears were streaming down my mother's face now, but she kept reading. But there's something you need to know, something I could never tell you while I was alive because I knew it would destroy you, and you weren't ready to be destroyed yet. You needed time to build yourself back up first. Linda, don't, Dad pleaded, and there was genuine anguish in his voice now. Not anger. Not pride. Just raw, desperate fear. But Mom was already reading the next line, and as the words left her lips, I felt the entire foundation of my life crack and shift beneath me. Richard knew about the money, she read. He's known since the day after your wedding. The world didn't end when my mother spoke those words. The reception hall didn't collapse. The lights didn't go out. But somehow, everything changed anyway, like reality had shifted 3 inches to the left, and nothing would ever line up quite the same way again. What? Mom's voice broke on the word. The letter trembled in her hands, and for the first time since this confrontation began, she looked uncertain. Vulnerable. That's not, he couldn't have. Keep reading, Dad said, and his voice was flat now. Resigned. All the fight had drained out of him like water from a broken glass. If you're going to do this, at least finish it. I wanted to stand up, to run, to drag Daniel away from this implosion of my family history. But I was frozen, watching my mother's eyes scan the rest of my grandmother's letter, watching her face cycle through confusion, shock, horror, and finally something that looked like understanding. No, she whispered. Then louder. No. That's impossible. What does it say? Katie asked, and I realized she was still gripping my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. Mrs. Patterson, what did your mother write? But Mom couldn't speak. She just stood there, the letter hanging from her fingers, staring at my father with an expression I couldn't decode. It wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal. It was something more complicated, something that looked almost like grief for a loss she hadn't known she'd suffered. I'll tell them, Dad said quietly. He looked around the room at all the watching faces. Family, friends, co-workers, people who'd thought they were just coming to a wedding reception, and instead got a front-row seat to our family's unraveling. I owe you that much, I suppose. After everything. He picked up his water glass and drained it. His hand was shaking so badly that ice cubes rattled against the rim. When he set it down, he met my eyes for the first time since this whole scene began. Your grandmother came to see me the morning after I proposed to your mother, he said. She told me she knew what kind of man I was. That she'd done her research. Asked around about my family, my reputation, my business practices. He laughed, but it was hollow. She was thorough, I'll give her that. Dad. I started, but he held up his hand. She told me she'd set up a trust for Linda. Explained the conditions. Said that if I was the man Linda believed I was, it wouldn't matter. We'd stay married, be happy, and the money would go to our children eventually. But if I was the man she suspected I was. He paused, swallowing hard. The money would be Linda's escape route. Mom sank back into her chair. You knew. All this time, you knew I had an exit plan, and you still. I thought I could beat it, Dad interrupted. I thought if I could just make it to 25 years, the money would go to Jessica, and Linda would be stuck. She'd have invested so much time in the marriage, gone through so much, that she wouldn't leave even when the deadline passed. I'd win. The money would stay in the family, just go to the next generation instead. He looked at me with something that might have been regret. I convinced myself I was doing it for you, sweetheart. Making sure you'd have that inheritance. The calculation of it hit me like a physical blow. You spent my entire childhood trying to keep Mom miserable enough to stay, but not miserable enough to leave. You were managing her unhappiness like a project. I told myself I was being strategic, Dad said. That I was protecting our family's assets. That your grandmother was the real manipulator, setting up this test like we were rats in a maze. He ran his hands through his hair. I convinced myself I was the victim. Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice tight with controlled anger. But you're not the victim here. You never were. No, Dad agreed quietly. No, I wasn't. Patricia, Daniel's mother, leaned forward. But if you knew about the trust, why did you mock Linda today? Why risk exposing everything? Dad's laugh was bitter. Because I genuinely forgot. After the divorce went through and Linda didn't fight me for more money, I assumed the trust had never existed. That her mother had been bluffing all along, or had changed her mind, or the money had been spent. It's been 2 years. Linda's been living in that small apartment, driving that old car, working at the library. I thought. He trailed off, looking at Mom with something that might have been wonder. I thought you really were struggling. I was acting, Mom said softly. Staying small. Staying invisible. Waiting for the right moment to show you that you'd lost. She picked up the letter again, her hands steadier now. But there's more, Richard. More that you don't know. Dad's expression shifted to confusion. What do you mean? Your mother told me everything about the trust. Not about the trust, Mom interrupted. About something else. Something she only put in this letter because she knew I'd be strong enough to handle it by the time I read it. She looked at me, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't name. Something about your father that changes everything. The room held its collective breath. Katie's grip on my arm had gone numb. Daniel had moved his chair closer to mine, his body positioned like he was ready to shield me from whatever came next. Even the catering staff had abandoned all pretense of work, standing frozen in the corners of the room. The trust was never about the money, Mom said, reading from the letter. The trust was a test, but not the kind Richard thought. I wasn't testing him to see if he'd be a good husband. I already knew he wouldn't be. I'd seen enough, heard enough, researched enough to know exactly what kind of man he was. Dad's face had gone slack. Then what? I was testing you, Linda, Mom continued. I needed to know if you were strong enough to survive him. If you could endure years of his contempt, his manipulation, his erosion of your self-worth, and still come out the other side intact. Because if you could do that, if you could survive Richard Patterson, then you could survive anything. A sob broke from Mom's throat, but she kept reading. I knew you'd marry him no matter what I said. You were too in love, too convinced you could fix him, too young to understand that some people don't want to be fixed. So I gave you armor instead. Not just money, but a secret. A piece of knowledge that would be yours alone, that he couldn't touch or diminish or control. Every time he made you feel small, you could think about that growing balance and know that you were bigger than he could see. That's beautiful, Katie whispered. That's manipulation, Dad countered, but there was no heat in it. He sounded tired, ancient, like he'd aged 20 years in 20 minutes. But here's what neither of you knew, Mom read, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The money was never the real test. It was never about whether Linda would leave or stay. It was about what Richard would do when he found out the truth. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Around the room, I could see people leaning forward, drawn in by the impossible tension of the moment. I told Richard about the trust the morning after he proposed, Mom continued reading. But I didn't tell him everything. I told him about the conditions. I told him about the deadline. But I didn't tell him the amount. Dad's eyes widened. You said it was substantial. I told him it was $500,000, Mom read, and I heard Patricia gasp. I watched his face when I said that number. Watched him calculate whether it was worth staying married for 25 years to ensure that money would go to his child instead of his wife. And I saw the moment he decided it was. That's why you stayed, I breathed, looking at Dad. You thought you were protecting my inheritance. The money was mine, Dad said defensively. From my family, my work. But the trust never had $500,000 in it, Mom read, and now her voice had taken on an edge. Not when I set it up. Not when I told Richard about it. Not even when I died. The silence was so complete I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. The initial amount was $53,000, Mom continued. Every cent I could scrape together from a lifetime of careful saving. I told Richard it was 10 times more than it actually was because I wanted to see if he'd be seduced by the idea of controlling that much money. If he'd stay in a marriage just to ensure his child got the inheritance instead of his wife. Dad stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. You're lying. The balance, I saw it. But I also told Linda something I didn't tell Richard. Mom read over his protests. I told her the name of my financial advisor. I told her to trust him completely. And I gave him instructions that Richard never knew about. Mom finally looked up from the letter, and her eyes were clear. Your grandmother didn't just invest the money, Richard. She leveraged it. Used it as collateral for investments that paid off over 20 years. By the time I could access it 2 years ago, that $53,000 had become $3.2 million, I whispered, remembering the number I'd seen in the passbook. The number that had seemed impossible. I bet on my daughter, Mom finished reading. I bet that she was smarter than Richard gave her credit for. That she could wait and watch and play the long game better than he ever could. And I bet that when the time came, she'd have the strength to walk away from him and walk toward her own future. Mom folded the letter carefully. She was right about everything except one thing. What's that? Dad asked hoarsely. She thought you stayed in the marriage because you wanted to protect Jessica's inheritance, Mom said. But that's not really why you stayed, is it, Richard? Dad opened his mouth, closed it, looked around the room like he was searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. Not anymore. Not with 200 people watching him realize that he'd spent 23 years of his life being manipulated by a woman he'd thought he was smarter than. No, he finally admitted. That's not why I stayed. Then why? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Dad sat back down, picked up his fallen chair, and stared at his hands. Because I couldn't stand the idea of her winning. Your grandmother threw down a gauntlet the morning after I proposed. She told me she didn't think I could be a good husband for 25 years. That I'd crack. That I'd show my true colors. That Linda would leave me. He looked up at Mom. And I was determined to prove her wrong. So you made us both miserable, Mom said. Just to win an argument with a dead woman. I made myself believe I was doing the right thing, Dad corrected. I told myself I was holding our family together. That your grandmother was the villain, trying to break us up. That the trust was a trap, and I was smart enough to avoid it. I reframed everything in my mind so I could be the hero of my own story. But you weren't the hero, I said. You were never the hero. No. Dad's shoulders slumped. I was just a man who couldn't admit he'd been outsmarted by his mother-in-law. Uncle Rick cleared his throat. So what happens now? It was a good question. We were still at my wedding reception. There was still cake to be cut, dances to be danced, toasts to be made. But how could we possibly continue with the normal rituals after everything that had just exploded across the head table? Mom stood up and walked around to where Dad sat. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and he flinched like he'd been burned. Now, she said gently, you get to decide what kind of man you want to be for the rest of your life. You can keep being the person who needs to win every interaction, who measures his worth by how much he can diminish others. Or you can take this opportunity to become someone different. Someone better. I don't know how, Dad whispered, and for the first time in my life, I saw him cry. Then you learn, Mom said simply. She removed her hand from his shoulder and turned to me. Sweetheart, I'm sorry this happened today. This wasn't how I wanted your wedding to go. Are you kidding? Katie said before I could respond. This is the most memorable wedding I've ever been to. People are going to be talking about this for decades. Despite everything, I laughed. That's one way to look at it. Daniel pulled me closer. Are you okay? He murmured into my hair. I don't know, I admitted. I think I need to process all of this. But also, I looked at the envelope containing our honeymoon itinerary. Also, I think I need to cut my wedding cake and dance with my husband and celebrate the fact that I married someone who would never, ever do what my father did. Never, Daniel agreed fiercely. Mom smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Then let's do that. Let's celebrate. Your grandmother would have wanted that. She always said that the best revenge is living well. Is that what this was? Dad asked, his voice raw. Revenge? No, Mom said after a moment. It was freedom. There's a difference. She returned to her seat, tucking the letter and the passbook back into her purse. The band, sensing that the storm had passed, started playing again, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. Conversations resumed around the room, quieter than before, charged with the electricity of having witnessed something they'd never forget. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't done yet, that there was still something else waiting to be revealed. Because my grandmother had been planning this for over 2 decades, and I'd learned enough in the last 30 minutes to know that she thought several steps ahead. Mom, I said slowly, was there anything else in that envelope? Any other letters? Mom's expression flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. Why do you ask? Because Grandma knew today would happen. She planned for you to confront Dad at my wedding, specifically. Which means she knew when I'd get married, or at least had a general idea. Which means she left something for you, Mom finished. She left instructions for me to give you after. She trailed off, looking at Dad. After I'd seen who he really was, I completed. After I couldn't have any illusions left. Mom nodded and reached into her purse one more time. This envelope was smaller, cream-colored instead of yellowed. My name was written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting. For Jessica, on her wedding day. To be opened only after the truth comes out. My hands shook as I took it from her. The envelope was light, containing only a single folded piece of paper. Around me, the reception continued, but I felt separated from it, cocooned in a bubble where only this letter mattered. Do you want me to read it with you? Daniel asked. I did. I desperately did. But something told me this was meant to be private, at least for the first reading. Give me a minute? He kissed my forehead. I'll be right here. I stood up and walked to the edge of the reception hall, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the garden where we'd taken our wedding photos just a few hours ago. The sun was setting now, painting everything gold and pink. It had been a beautiful day. It was still a beautiful day despite everything. I opened the envelope. My dearest Jessica, the letter began. If you're reading this, then you've just witnessed your mother's triumph and your father's reckoning. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see it, but I trust your mother to tell the story well. I smiled despite the tears that were already forming. You're probably confused right now. Maybe angry. Certainly overwhelmed. You're wondering why I orchestrated such a dramatic reveal. Why I couldn't have just told your mother the truth while I was alive, why I made everyone wait so long for closure. She wasn't wrong. The answer is simple, my darling girl. Some lessons can only be learned through experience. Your mother needed to learn that she was stronger than she thought. Your father needed to learn that he wasn't as clever as he believed. And you needed to learn the most important lesson of all. I held my breath, waiting. You needed to learn that love should never make you smaller. The words hit me like a wave. I thought about all the years I'd watched my parents' marriage, the way Dad had slowly eroded Mom's confidence, the way she'd learned to apologize for taking up space. I thought about how I'd almost accepted that as normal, as what marriage looked like. Watch your mother carefully in the years ahead, the letter continued. Watch how she rebuilds herself. Watch how she takes up space without apologizing for it. Watch how she learns to be whole again. And then, when you're tempted to diminish yourself for anyone, even someone you love, remember what you saw today. I was crying openly now, not caring who saw. The money isn't the important part, sweetheart. The money is just money. What matters is the choice your mother made to survive with her dignity intact. What matters is the strength it took to play the long game, to be patient, to wait for the right moment to show the world who she really was. There was more, but I couldn't read it through my tears. I folded the letter carefully and turned back to the reception. Mom was watching me from across the room, her expression questioning. I nodded, trying to tell her without words that I understood, that I saw her, that I was proud of her. But as I started walking back to the table, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Dad had his phone out, and his face had gone pale again. He was staring at the screen like it contained the secrets of the universe, his mouth hanging slightly open. Richard, Patricia asked tentatively. Is everything all right? He didn't answer. He just turned the phone around so we could all see the screen. It was his banking app, open to what looked like his investment account. The balance was displayed in large numbers at the top. The account was empty. What? Dad started, but his voice wouldn't work properly. There was supposed to be. Mom's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. Oh, she said softly. I suppose we should talk about that too. What did you do? Dad's voice came out strangled, like someone was squeezing his throat. He stood up, holding his phone out like it was evidence of a crime. Linda, what the hell did you do? I didn't do anything, Mom said calmly. But you did. You signed papers. Made agreements. Do you remember? The color drained from my father's face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles going white, and I watched him try to work backward through 2 years of post-divorce transactions, trying to find the trap he'd apparently walked into. The settlement, he whispered. You said you didn't want anything from the investments. I said I didn't want anything from the marital investments, Mom corrected. And I didn't. You kept all of those. The retirement accounts, the stock portfolio, everything we'd built together during the marriage. I signed off on all of it without a fight. Then how is my personal account empty? Dad's voice was rising now, attracting attention from nearby tables again. That money was mine before we got married. It was never marital property. It should still be. Sit down, Richard, Uncle Rick said quietly. You're making a scene. I'm making a scene? Dad's laugh was wild. My ex-wife apparently stole my life savings, and I'm the one making a scene? I didn't steal anything, Mom said, still maddeningly calm. But your mother did give me something interesting in her estate. Do you want to tell everyone what that was, or should I? Dad sank back into his chair. No, you wouldn't have, she wouldn't have. Your mother, Mom said, turning to address the table at large, passed away 3 years ago. About a year before Richard and I divorced. She left most of her estate to Richard, of course. The house, the car, her jewelry. But she left one thing to me. I'd forgotten about that. Dad's mother had died suddenly of a stroke, and the funeral had been tense and uncomfortable. I'd assumed it was just normal grief, but now I wondered what else had been simmering under the surface. She left me a letter, Mom continued. And in that letter, she explained something I hadn't known about Richard's personal investment account. The one he's just discovered is empty. Dad put his head in his hands. Mom, please don't do this. Your mother funded that account, Mom said to me. Back when Richard was just starting his career, fresh out of college, she gave him a substantial gift. Told him to invest it wisely, grow it, use it as his safety net. She made him promise to never tell anyone where the seed money came from because she was embarrassed about helping him. She wanted him to seem like a self-made man. That money was mine, Dad said through his fingers. She gave it to me. It was a gift. It was a loan, Mom corrected, and Dad's head snapped up. That's what she explained in her letter. She'd structured it as a gift for tax purposes, but there was a verbal agreement between them. If Richard ever divorced before his 30th wedding anniversary, he'd pay back the principal amount to her estate. Daniel's father whistled low. And if she was dead when the divorce happened, then the debt transferred to her designated heir, Mom said. Which she specified in her will would be me. The pieces clicked together in my head. Dad's mother left him everything else, but she left you his debt. And then you waited until after the divorce was finalized to collect. Not quite, Mom said. I waited until the perfect moment. Until today, specifically. Because I wanted Richard to feel secure. I wanted him to believe he'd won the divorce, that he'd kept all his precious investments and his independence while I struggled with my little library job and my studio apartment. I wanted him to feel so comfortable in his victory that he'd forget to be cautious. This is insane, Dad muttered. This whole thing is insane. My mother, your mother, both of them manipulating us from beyond the grave. They were protecting me, Mom interrupted. Your mother because she knew what kind of son she'd raised, and my mother because she knew what kind of man you were. They both saw you clearly, Richard, even when I couldn't. Katie was practically bouncing in her seat. So how much did he owe? The initial gift was $250,000, Mom said. Which, adjusted for inflation, and according to the terms his mother specified in her letter, came to approximately $420,000. Dad made a sound like he'd been punched. You took everything. The account had $400,000 in it. You took everything. I took what was legally owed to your mother's estate, Mom corrected. The fact that you'd only grown the initial investment by $150,000 over 30 years says something about your financial acumen, doesn't it? My mother grew $53,000 to over $3 million in about the same time period. Makes you wonder who was really better with money. The observation landed like a bomb. I watched Dad's face cycle through emotions, rage, humiliation, defeat, before settling on something that looked like nausea. I need air, he said, standing up abruptly. I can't. Go, Mom said gently. But Richard, when you come back, you're going to write Jessica and Daniel a check. For the wedding gift you were planning to give them. You just took everything. You have your salary. You have the house. You have the car and the boat, and all the marital investments I let you keep. You have plenty. Mom's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. And you're going to give your daughter a wedding gift that reflects how much you supposedly love her. Not a token amount. Not a check that says this is all I could spare. A real gift. Dad looked at me, and I saw him realize that this was his last chance. That if he walked away now without doing what Mom asked, he'd lose me completely. That I'd seen too much today to ever look at him the same way again. And his only hope of salvaging any kind of relationship with me was to prove he could be better than the man we'd all witnessed over the past hour. How much? He asked hoarsely. Whatever you think is appropriate, Mom said. Whatever amount you'd have given if you weren't a man who measures love in power and control. He nodded once, jerkily, and walked away toward the bathrooms. We watched him go in silence. That was brutal, Patricia said finally. Necessary maybe, but brutal. His mother's letter said something else, Mom told her. She said that if Richard could make it to his 30th anniversary without divorcing, the debt would be forgiven. She was giving him one last chance to prove he could put his wife before his pride. That he could be the husband she hoped he'd become. But you divorced at 23 years, I said. He filed, Mom corrected. I didn't want the divorce, not really. I'd made my peace with the marriage. I had my secret nest egg growing, I had my independence in small ways, and I was prepared to wait until the 30th anniversary, so the debt would be forgiven and he'd never have to know about it. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. But then he met someone. The world tilted again. What? Her name is Veronica, Mom said. She works in his office. She's 32. Very pretty. Very impressed by his boat, and his investment portfolio, and his stories about being a self-made man. Mom's smile was sad. He told me he wanted a divorce because we'd grown apart. Because we wanted different things. Because it was nobody's fault, just the natural end of a marriage that had run its course. But he was having an affair, Daniel said flatly. He was preparing to have one, Mom corrected. I don't think anything physical had happened yet. But he'd found someone who made him feel important, who looked at him the way I'd stopped looking at him years ago, and he decided that was worth more than 3 more years of marriage. Worth more than forgiveness of a $400,000 debt he didn't even know he owed. So he threw away everything for pride, Mom finished. For the ego boost of a younger woman's attention. For the fantasy of starting over as someone new and improved. He threw away his financial security and any moral high ground he might have had, all because he couldn't resist the flattery of someone who didn't know him well enough to see his flaws. I thought about the past 2 years, about the times I'd had dinner with Dad and he'd seemed lighter, happier. About the way he'd talked about finding himself and embracing this new chapter. I'd thought he was healing from the divorce. I hadn't realized he'd engineered the divorce himself, traded in his wife like a car he'd grown tired of driving. Is he still with her? I asked. Veronica? She left him about 6 months ago, Mom said. Apparently, once she realized he wasn't as wealthy as he'd implied, and once the novelty of being with an older man wore off, she found someone else. Someone closer to her own age. Someone with better prospects. Katie actually laughed at that. So he destroyed his marriage, lost $500,000 and ended up alone anyway. That's almost poetic. It's sad, Mom said, but she didn't sound sad. She sounded tired. It's a waste of everyone's time and energy. We could have just made it to 30 years. The debt would have been forgiven. He could have kept his money. We might have even found a way to be happy, or at least content. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't wait 3 more years. Because he didn't know about the deadline, I realized. He knew about Grandma's trust deadline, 25 years, but he didn't know about his mother's deadline of 30 years. 2 women, 2 tests, 2 deadlines, Mom agreed. And he failed them both. Dad returned before I could respond, walking slowly like he'd aged decades in the bathroom. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he had a piece of paper in his hand, a check, I realized. He stopped in front of me and Daniel, holding it out with a shaking hand. This is everything I can afford right now, he said quietly. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's what I have. I took the check and looked at the amount. $25,000. It was more than I'd expected, honestly. More than I'd have thought he could spare given what Mom had just revealed about his financial situation. Thank you, I said, because what else could I say? I'm sorry, Jessica. Dad's voice cracked. I'm sorry you had to see all of this today. I'm sorry you had to learn what kind of man your father really is on what should be the happiest day of your life. The day's not over yet, I said carefully. We can still make it happy. He nodded, not meeting my eyes. I should go. I'm not. I shouldn't stay for the rest of the reception. Not after all this. Part of me wanted to protest, to tell him to stay, to try to salvage something from the wreckage. But a larger part of me, the part that had been taking notes all evening, learning lessons my grandmother had intended me to learn, knew that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was let someone leave with what little dignity they had left. Okay, I said. But Dad, I want you to get help. Real help. Therapy, not just time to lick your wounds. He looked surprised. You still want me in your life after. You're my father, I interrupted. I don't know what our relationship looks like now, or what it's going to look like going forward. But I know I want you to be better. Not for me. For you. Because this, I gestured at the wreckage of the scene we'd all just witnessed. This isn't who you have to be. Dad's eyes filled with tears again. He nodded, unable to speak, and then he turned and walked away. This time, we all knew he wouldn't be coming back. The reception hall was quiet in his wake. The band had stopped playing again, sensing that nobody was really in a dancing mood despite the beautiful music, and the expensive decorations, and the elaborate cake that still needed to be cut. Well, Uncle Rick said finally, I think we could all use a drink. That broke the tension. People laughed, conversations resumed, and slowly the reception began to recover from the drama that had dominated the last hour. But I noticed people kept glancing at my mother, at me, at the empty chair where my father had been sitting. We'd become the story of the night, the tale that would be retold at family gatherings for years to come. Mom, I said quietly, pulling her aside while Daniel went to handle something with the photographer. Did you plan all of this? The timing of everything. She considered the question carefully. Your grandmother planned it. She left incredibly detailed instructions. When to tell you about the trust. When to confront your father. When to reveal the debt. She orchestrated it like a symphony, and I just played my part. But why at my wedding? Why not do it privately? Because she knew Richard would never be able to resist making a scene if he saw me offering you money, Mom said. She knew his pride would override his common sense. She knew he'd try to humiliate me in public, which would give me the opening I needed to humiliate him instead. And she knew you needed to see it happen. Needed to witness the whole ugly truth, so you'd never have any illusions about what your father was capable of. It was cold when you thought about it, calculating, but it was also brilliant. She really thought of everything. She spent 25 years planning this, Mom said. She knew she wouldn't live to see it, but she wanted to make sure it happened exactly right. That you'd learn the lessons you needed to learn. That I'd get the closure I needed. That your father would face consequences for the first time in his life. And the debt from his mother? Was that really enforceable? Mom's smile turned slightly wicked. Let's just say there was enough documentation in her will to make a legal case. And Richard knew that if I pushed it, the story would come out in court. Everyone would know that his self-made success was built on his mother's money. Everyone would know about Veronica. Everyone would know what kind of man he really was. She shrugged. He decided it was easier to just pay it back than to fight and risk exposure. You blackmailed him. I gave him a choice, Mom corrected. He could have chosen differently. I thought about that. About choices and consequences. About the difference between manipulation and protection. About whether the ends justified the means when the means involved orchestrating public humiliation at your daughter's wedding. Are you okay with all this? Mom asked, reading my expression. I know it's a lot. I know you probably wish. I'm okay, he interrupted. And surprisingly, I meant it. It's a lot, and it's going to take me time to process. But I'm okay. Because I got to see you finally stand up to him. I got to see you be powerful. And I got to learn that love should never make you smaller. I smiled. Grandma taught me that today. Even though she's been dead for over a decade. Mom pulled me into a hug, and we stood there for a long moment, just holding each other while the reception swirled around us. When we pulled apart, I saw Daniel approaching with 2 champagne flutes. I think it's time to cut the cake, he said. And make a toast. And dance. And do all the normal wedding things that don't involve family drama and financial manipulation. Sounds perfect, I agreed. But as we walked toward the elaborate 3-tier cake that probably cost more than my first car, I noticed my mother lingering behind, pulling out her phone. She was texting someone, her expression unreadable. Mom? Everything okay? She looked up, startled, and quickly put her phone away. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just handling some loose ends. What loose ends? I asked, but she just smiled mysteriously and gestured toward the cake. We'll talk about it later. Right now, this is your moment. Enjoy it. And I tried. I really did. Daniel and I cut the cake to applause and camera flashes. We fed each other bites while carefully avoiding smashing it into each other's faces, much to Katie's vocal disappointment. We danced our first dance while everyone watched with the kind of intensity that comes from having witnessed real drama and now craving the comfort of normal, scripted romance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something else coming. That my grandmother's elaborate plan wasn't quite finished yet. That the story still had one more chapter to tell. And when my mother's phone buzzed during our father-daughter dance, a role my uncle had stepped in to fill, and I saw her expression shift from relaxed to intensely focused, I knew I was right. I need to take this, she mouthed to me, already backing away toward the exit. I nodded, trying to stay present in the moment, trying to enjoy dancing with Uncle Rick, who was doing his best to fill impossible shoes. But my eyes kept tracking my mother as she paced outside the reception hall, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing emphatically. When the song ended and Uncle Rick twirled me one final time, I found Daniel immediately. Something's happening, I told him. With Mom. I need to. Go, he said, understanding instantly. I'll handle things here. I kissed him quickly and made my way through the crowd of wedding guests, most of whom were now several drinks in and delightfully unconcerned with family drama. I found Mom outside on the venue's terrace, phone still pressed to her ear, staring out at the garden where twilight had settled like a blanket. I understand, she was saying. Yes. Tomorrow morning. I'll be there. She paused, listening. No, she doesn't know yet. I'll tell her tonight. Another pause. Thank you. For everything. She hung up and stood there for a moment, her back to me, shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths. Mom! She turned, and there were tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling. Actually smiling, wide and genuine, and full of something that looked almost like wonder. There's one more thing, she said. One more thing your grandmother arranged. But this one, her voice broke. This one is going to change everything.